This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Welcome to this event in the name of Canning House and in association with the Institute of Latin American Studies and supported by Latin American News, Institute of Latin American Studies and the Caribbean Council. We're very grateful for their support on this event. As you know, the talk, or the three talks from our distinguished panel, will be about the evaluation of the reforms and the changes and opportunities for foreign investment in Cuba under the current government there. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our three distinguished Cuba specialists. Dr. Emily Morris will talk first. She is Research Associate and Lecturer in Economic Development of Latin America and the Caribbean at UCL. She'll be followed by David Jessop, Managing Director of the Caribbean Council and also of the Britain-Cuba Initiative and another leading expert on business in Cuba. And then Dr. Antoni Kapcia from Nottingham University, Professor of Latin American History, who will follow up on their economic and business views with the political angle of the reforms. They'll each talk for approximately 10 minutes and then we'll open it for questions and answers for 35 to 40 minutes, and thereafter we'll be filing out through there, down the corridor and up the stairs for a reception. And the only other housekeeping point is that should the fire alarm sound during the course of the talk, the exit route is through there and people will be on hand to guide you out of the building. So once again, thank you to the distinguished panel, and without further ado, I'll hand you over to Dr. Emily Morris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I've got a slide presentation, and I'm not quite sure whether people in the extremes can actually see it, so you might want to move in a little bit here. What I'm going to talk about today is, well, the economic reforms to some extent. I'm assuming that most people here are aware of the process that's going on, so I'm not actually going to go in detail about the economic reforms. And then I'm going to talk about the next challenge, what I see as being the next challenge. And this ties in with the publication that came out a few weeks ago, published by the Latin American Newsletters, which I wrote in association, in collaboration with another economist who's based in Australia, about the question of the dual currency system in Cuba. I'm going to try and talk within 10 minutes. I'm not quite sure how long it will have to take, but I will have to go over things quite quickly. But please do ask questions for clarification afterwards if I'm not clear enough. So first of all, the story so far. The title of the session is Raul Castro's Reforms. And since he came in to office 2006, initially 2008, formally, he's been working on trying to reform the economic system. And this culminated in April 2011 with the lineamientos, the guidelines for economic policy, 313 guidelines in various chapters covering different things, after an extensive consultation period. But that consultation period itself came after several years of preparation for these reforms. So this didn't come out of nowhere at all. And, sorry, I'm just looking for my notes. So the reforms that are underway, there's a whole bundle of them. And in general, there's a large element of what we might describe as liberalising reforms, but that's far from what they are entirely. There are other things apart from liberalisation that's going on here. And the ones underway, we can kind of summarise them in a list. We've got the state sector rationalisation and decentralisation, two separate things. The state sector is being shrunk, but also all of the enterprises and entities within the state sector are being reorganised. And new systems of accounting, new systems of allocation of resources are being developed. Secondly, there's an expanding non-state sector. The shrinkage of the state sector actually marks a very important shift in policy, and that is that Cubans no longer have a guarantee of employment. So the private sector is being deliberately expanded in order to absorb some of the people laid off in the public sector. Having said that, it's not completely true that unemployment is going to be allowed to rise to any level. It's still an objective to ensure that the process of change is inhibited by the constraint of ensuring that there is enough work for all, which is an important constraint on the whole process. Thirdly, the redistribution of land. Of course, Cuban agriculture has never been completely turned over to the state. There's always been private farmers and cooperatives, but now there are a whole lot more land is being transferred to other farmers, and there are all sorts of systems. Like I said, credits here. There's new systems of distribution of supplies, new credits, new land registry, and so on. There's a vast amount of things going on in agriculture in an attempt to raise output there. And there's more direct taxation. There's a shift in the fiscal management, whereas before the government got most of its money from aportes, or from its share of production, if you like. So the surplus was taken by the government in order to pay for public services. Increasingly now, there's a shift from that to direct taxation of the new private sector. So there's now income taxes and profits taxes are being developed. And those actually are going to start to apply to the state sector as well. So state enterprises, instead of paying aportes, will be paying taxes on their profits. And there's a creation of a new housing market. People are buying and selling houses. It's not fully developed. There isn't a mortgage system. There are credits for doing up houses, but it's in very early stages. People don't think of their houses as an asset yet, although they have become an asset, which is interesting. Sort of a psychological shift, a leap hasn't been made. So all of these things are going on, and in addition to that, there's a new development zone. Last few weeks, the new law came out for a development zone around the Mariel port. A massive investment, $1 billion in the development of Mariel port to take bigger ships from the Panama Canal, but also a huge development zone around it. And this is part of a general discussion about the relationship between the Cuban state and foreign investors. And there are changes going on there, which I'm sure David will talk about more. So the results of these things so far have actually been disappointing. It has to be said, each year the economic forecast is made in December, and each year for the past few years the performance has been less than anticipated. Not hugely, there hasn't been a contraction, the economy is still growing, but it has been disappointing in many ways. And I would like to argue that this is because there's a challenge which really now has become the main constraint on performance in the coming 5 years. So we're halfway through the lineamientos, performance hasn't been great, and the next big challenge is currency reform. So this is the case that I'm making. If we look very quickly, at the performance of the currency, here we've got currency, the value of the Cuban peso relative to the US dollar. There's been different regimes during this period from 1990 to now, because initially the US dollar wasn't legal tender, and then there was the dollar and the CUC came in to substitute it. So there's been changes in regimes, but nonetheless you can still track the performance. And so you're looking at the value of the Cuban peso over that time. So there's a complete collapse of the value of the Cuban peso in the early 1990s when there was a crisis, and then a quite amazing stabilization process which managed to restore its value substantially, but obviously only partially, in the mid-1990s. And since then, there's been an economic recovery. So the economy, by 2006, the economy had recovered to where it was in 1990. But you still have the value of the Cuban peso is very much less than what it used to be. So you had a recovery from the mid-1990s to the mid-noughties. And during that period, economic management, macroeconomic management was very cautious because they'd had the collapse of the currency and what was effectively a huge inflation and decline in real wages, and they didn't want to experience that again. So you see a fiscal balance, very close to balance all through that period. You have close control of monetary emission, but you have a kind of stabilization at a lower value of the Cuban peso in the market. From about 2004, you have a surge in GDP growth to 2008, but that didn't make any difference. So there's no improvement in the value of the Cuban peso during that period. After that, you have a kind of stagnation, and it's that stagnation which precipitated the reforms. We have to do one, move on. So we've got a recovery in the economy, but the dualism is still remaining. And what that means is the following, is that neither currency, neither the CUC or the CUP, the Cuban peso is a CUP and the convertible peso is a CUC, and they're both a bit of a mouthful, but neither of them actually fulfills the function of money. An example, the obvious example to anyone who's been to Cuba, is the average Cuban state salary is 500 CUP per month. How much is that worth? Right? You can either say that it's worth 500 CUC or $500, and you might say, well, that's ridiculous, of course it's not worth that much, we know it's not worth that much, but actually, if you measure what they can consume with that, it is around $500 worth. But the perception of what it's worth is hugely distorted by subsidies and by distorted exchange rates. So it's very difficult to actually measure what it's really worth. What it's perceived to be worth is 20 CUC or $20, which is what all of the articles in the press keep saying. The Cubans are living on $20 a month. And quite simply, if they were living on $20 a month, they would all be dead. So we know that that's not the case. But so it looks like it's $20, but it's not. So that raises a question. The reforms are introducing more use of the market mechanism. But the use of the market mechanism itself is supposed to be the price system, is that price helps, well, price becomes the way in which resources are allocated according to their relative scarcities. We all know that, we do economics, and that's how the market mechanism works. That's how the market mechanism, when it works, and we know it doesn't always work very well, but when it does work, it works because the price operates as the mediator of value. But it's extending the use of the market mechanism without a measure of value. You haven't got a unit of money that actually tells you anything, is a recipe for a very distorted economic system, a very distorted set of economic decisions that are being made all the way through the economy. And I would say that's why it's stagnating. So if we look at the imperative, the reason, the kind of things that it causes are the obvious labour market disincentives, low productivity of state workers. They're not getting paid very much. There's a joke, the state pretends to pay them and they pretend to do the work and all the rest of it. But that's not quite true, because a lot of state workers work incredibly hard. But there is this thing, low productivity, they're not incentivised, and more than that, they are incentivised to do all sorts of things on the side, take time off, divert resources and sell them around the corner and so on. All of that we know is going on. It's obvious, it's evident, and it's now freely discussed and admitted. In the non-state sector, the new growing state sector, there's 25 to 1 exchange rate. The CUP, the Cuban peso, is undervalued, seriously undervalued. And so you could say that that state sector is being stimulated. When you have an undervalued currency, it stimulates activity because it's easy to be competitive with a very weak currency. Yeah? But what it's actually doing is encouraging the kind of businesses that, that operate at extremely low levels of productivity. So if you're just a car park attendant and you earn $1 a day, you can convert that into Cuban pesos and you can live on that. But that means your productivity in international comparable terms is only $1 a day. And it's not the way the Cuban economy wants to develop. So there's a problem of low productivity of the non-state sector, the growing non-state sector. In the state sector, The official rate is 1-to-1, which is overvalued and therefore not competitive. So it's impossible for state companies which are actually using 1-to-1 to be competitive. And therefore, if they want to get foreign exchange, they have to apply for it. It's rationed. It's not rationed by price, it's rationed by administration, which is hugely inhibiting of any kind of initiative or creativity or responsiveness to changes in the pattern of demand and supply. So you've got a stagnated state sector because it can't respond to international signals. It can't respond to international prices. So you've got the rationing, so you've got a kind of bureaucratic, non-dynamic system in the state sector. And that little bit I put here is actually very important. It's every day that passes, productivity falls and adjustment becomes harder. Every day that passes, the private sector is growing and people are becoming habituated to doing incredibly low productivity activities in the private sector, or distorting things, or stealing, or finding ways to manage in this distorted economy. The official policy I'm putting here is, in the lineamientos, there was only one of the 313 guidelines related to the exchange rate, and it said there will be progress towards unification, monetary unification, taking into account productivity, labour productivity, and the effectiveness mechanisms, distributed mechanisms, and redistributive mechanisms. I mean, it's very sort of taking into account everything. It doesn't tell you anything about how they're going to do it. It's very complex, and it will need rigorous preparation, and it's going to take a long time. We're going to take everything into account. They're trying to protect the achievements of the revolution while at the same time making this big change. And what I said in the article was that there seemed to be a lack of urgency here. And so since the article was written, actually the announcement has been made that the process is really beginning, and there's a program for the unification to happen. There's no more information about the program, about how it's going to be done, but I think that's actually quite understandable, because if you declare what you're going to do with an exchange rate, then it becomes possible for anybody and everybody to make a one-way bet. I mean, if you know that an exchange rate is going to appreciate, you just simply speculate that way. So in a way, it's kind of allowing a degree of uncertainty about how it's going to be done and when it's going to be done. But it is, the economists in Cuba are talking about 18 months it's going to be done. So there's going to be a huge change. Once this is achieved, it's going to change everything within Cuba. Okay, so what unification requires is two things, and it is very complicated. It's the appreciation of the Cadeca rate, the unofficial rate, the 25-to-1 one, an appreciation of the value of the CUP, and plus a depreciation of the official rate. So the 1-to-1 has got to turn to somewhere near, if we say 10-to-1, 7-to-1, and the 25-to-1 has got to change. They've got to move towards each other. How do you do that? Do you do that in one fell swoop, or do you do it bit by bit? At the moment, they're doing it bit by bit. Little parts of the economy are being experimented with. And what I argued in the report is that I think that in a way, I mean, there's a fear in Cuba. There's a big fear in the central bank about the social and economic implications of a sudden shock to the system. They don't want to impose a shock on the system. But I would argue that the shock is probably less fearsome than possibly they think, because of the strange nature of the Cuban economy, which is quite unique compared to anywhere else. So if we look at the impact, the immediate impact of a Cadeca rate appreciation in the peculiar system that there is, and this is rather small, but what I argue is that if you think of, if you're a Cuban family with a CUP income, a large proportion of your income is spent in Cuban pesos on Cuban peso goods. And a large proportion of those goods, but not all of them, are bought at subsidized prices. And then you spend another large proportion on the agro markets. So the amount that you're actually spending on imported goods for which you will need CUC is actually quite small. So it's not like other economies. You've got these segregated markets. You've got different markets. You've got the subsidized goods and the other goods. And the outcome of that is that there's actually a very low elasticity of demand for foreign exchange. So you won't have a sudden huge surge in demand for imported goods, which you could get in other circumstances where you didn't have these segregated markets. And in those households which have remittances, which live on remittances in CUCs, those households will actually, rather than spending less on Cuban peso goods, it's very peculiar. Usually if you have an appreciation, you'd spend less of your money on the currency that's appreciated, because the value of those goods would be, they wouldn't be so cheap. But in the case of Cuba, they're already much cheaper. There's separation of markets, and goods in those markets are very much cheaper. So what effectively happened is that those people with CUC incomes, with remittances and so on, would have to spend more money in the Cuban market. They'd actually have to sell more CUCs. And that's a very peculiar exchange rate system. It's described in economic textbooks as a Marshall Lerner condition where the elasticities don't behave like they're supposed to. And this is what the case of Cuba is. It's not normal. So the impact would be a relatively minor impact rather than a major shock on the foreign exchange market, on the Cadeca market. An actual decline, it wouldn't be inflationary, it would be a decline. For those people earning CUP incomes, the only impact, because most of the prices are fixed anyway in the Cuban peso market, would be that things, when they went to the dollar shop or cook shops, they would be able to buy more. So it's actually anti-inflationary. It increased the real value of people's incomes. And then the effect on employment, it would be damaging to those people who are now the car park attendants earning less than what's really enough to live on, because their dollar a day would be worth less when they transfer it to CUP. I'm going over time. So there would be winners and losers. And the losers would be the low productivity people in the private sector. And the winners would be all the people in the state sector who've suffered so long with extremely low real incomes. If you had a depreciation of the official rate, going through the same thing again, your market's not free in Cuba. The foreign exchange is allocated. It's not a freely operating market in which people buy and sell foreign exchange. So prices of imported goods are fixed by the state. Domestic enterprises' access to foreign exchange is rationed. And the enclave trading enterprises, that's the joint ventures, they operate entirely in the external sector anyway, so they're not even affected by it. So the impact on them would be little effect on inflation. The domestic enterprise sector would still have foreign exchange rationalised until it was lifted, and the enclave sector would not be affected. So the shock impact would be relatively small. So actually they can move quite quickly on this, is what I'm arguing. They could move quite quickly without having a major detrimental effect on the economy, but there would be winners and losers. And the eventual benefits of unification, and I've kind of put at 7 CUP to 1 CUC, so it's 24, 25 now. So somewhere between, could be 10, but there's signs that it maybe is slightly less than 10 to 1. Experiments are already happening in isolated parts with that. The benefits would be in the private sector, there'd be higher productivity, it would force productivity up. And there'd be reduced incentive for cheating, because what you're enabling is a reduction of the gap between the different markets, which is a large part of private sector activity, is actually cheating. It's somehow diverting goods from one of the markets and selling it in the other one. And cheating, that kind of intermediation doesn't actually increase total output in the economy. And in the state sector, you'd have improved incentives. You could actually have, salaries meaning something, and you could also have meaningful decentralization and dynamism. That is, at the moment, companies are supposed to be moving towards profit and loss accounting, but they can't really do it because they don't have an exchange rate to use. So the more that you can have an exchange rate, you can actually start to look at whether you're profitable, whether you're not profitable, how you might improve efficiency in some meaningful way that reflects relative scarcities. And so this is actually the final slide. You haven't given me a slip of paper yet.
No, you're fine.
So having said so, what I'm suggesting is that this is a hugely important step. It's got to happen really before, well, it's in terms of sequencing reforms, it's really now is the time for it to happen. And so the fact that the government has actually begun on the process is a positive thing. It still seems to have a slight sort of lack of urgency, and possibly because of the fear that's going on. There are many, many more questions about how it can be done and all the rest of it. It seems like the government's going to do it piecemeal, which would normally be a recipe for disaster in a kind of conventional economy, but since the economy itself is very fractured, there's a possibility to do that. But there are many more questions, and in the paper we go on to some of these a little bit. If you have unification, then what do you do? Is it fixed or does it float? Does it float according to demand and supply in the market? In which case, if you have a floating exchange rate, that creates a whole lot of other questions about whether it floats, it's too volatile or not. Most exchange rate systems are some form of managed float. So you can have pegs, or you can have target ranges, or whatever. And the suggestion in the article is that it would need to be some kind of managed system. If it's managed, how could it be managed? You'd have a currency board. That's systems that's been used elsewhere. If you have a currency board and you have a target rate, do you target it against the dollar, or do you target it against the renminbi, or do you target it against a basket of goods? All of those questions have to be asked. And then the level of reserves required. I mean, to what extent would the Cubans need to have a cushion of international reserves? All of those questions are open, and obviously they're being considered at the moment. But the constraint within which the whole process is being done is how to do this, how to overcome the difficulties created by US sanctions and at the same time maintain social commitments in a way that the margin for manoeuvre that the Cuban authorities have is constrained between these two constraints. Any other country trying to move towards a unified exchange rate which is convertible on the international markets would have access to IMF backup in the case of crisis. Cuba has no access to IMF backup, so therefore possibly it would need to be more tightly managed and have a higher stock of reserves in order to maintain it. And secondly, the Cuban government has given itself this massive commitment to sustain its social commitments, and therefore that limits the room for manoeuvre. They want to make sure that real wages don't fall below a certain level and so on. So that creates a constraint. So I mean, that's where I'm finishing, just to give you some things to think about and maybe give you a headache and try and work on those things. But any questions, I'd be very glad to try to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to David Jessop.
Thanks very much, Rob. Let me start by sort of indicating where our starting point is. As Director of Britain's Cuba Initiative, we've been working since the mid-1990s with UK companies to encourage investment in Cuba. And as a part of that, because we have an unusual structure in as much that it has a Cuban side, so the Minister of Foreign Investment in Cuba is the counterpart to the present chairman of the Cuba Initiative in the United Kingdom, Lord Hutton. It means that we've had the opportunity for consistent, long-term dialogue with the Cubans about economic perspectives as well as, to some extent, political perspectives. What I particularly want to talk about is a different aspect of the reform process in the context of foreign investment, and to suggest this evening that the reform process currently underway in Cuba may actually lead to a change in US policy with implications for the way we in the United Kingdom and in Europe relate to Cuba and its economy. The reason I say this is because I think one of the more important announcements that Raul Castro made earlier this year has almost been ignored in terms of its implications. In February of this year, he made clear that he's going to step down in 2018. And not enough notice, I think, has been taken of this, or the political or economic significance of what will happen over the next 5 years to meet the criteria for change that he set out at the same time as indicating that he was going to step down. Let alone much consideration being given to the potential significance of his decision to the US relationship. As Emily indicated, and I imagine most of you will know, Cuba's gradually moving to a managed, socially oriented economy in which the party and the organs of state direct and plan, but in which many of the day-to-day economic decisions will in future be taken by others in enterprise organizations and a private sector operating within a new regulated framework. What's important is, I think, and which I also think has been ignored, is this process has to be complete by the time President Castro steps down, as he is effectively the stabilizing and driving force underwriting the progress and authenticity of the reform process. What is also happening in parallel during this period is there's a new generation of believers in Cuban nationalism and socialism being brought into every Cuban government department and enterprise in really very large numbers, with the objective that they better manage a restructured economy. In other words, the departure of Fidel and Raul and the appearance of a new generation may, and I'll explain why in a moment, make the possibility of US engagement easier and perhaps less contentious in the United States. In that context, it's very important to recognize that what Cuba is not doing is changing its political system. That is, despite the fact that the US public rhetoric continues, largely for domestic consumption in the US, but Raul Castro's retirement in 2018 implies, I think, and I'll explain why in a moment, that change is possible in the US economic relationship, but not the political relationship. Let me try to explain a little bit. One of the key stumbling blocks in US legislation and in the United States political system has been the presence of both Raul Castro and Fidel Castro. That's actually incorporated in some parts of US legislation, in Helms-Burton, for instance, in Torricelli. So there is an implied suggestion that Raul Castro's stepping down opens the way for change. However, as Cuba has no intention of discussing its political system with the US or indeed with anyone else, this means that the only option for an improved relationship with the United States will be to find ways to develop pragmatic, multiple and diverse economic relationships, including those with the United States. My sense is that in Cuba today, there's a very carefully calibrated approach underway aimed at changing the political and economic balance in the nation's external relationships to that end. In other words, it suggests that the US, around about the time or before the time that President Castro steps down, will have a choice. Future US administrations, seeing all other nations taking advantage of change in the Cuban economy, will have to decide whether an economic relationship that goes beyond trade is possible. And it's important, I think, to see those considerations, to set them alongside changing US policy and changing US electoral politics. As seems to be the case, the probability of another democratic administration in the US is high, partly because of changing demographics in the United States. Also, thinking within the Cuban American population is undergoing generational change, and as is its influence as a proportion of the overall Hispanic vote in the United States. What's also happening at the same time is there's growing pressure from a range of US businesses in seeing that others, as a consequence of seeing an advantage that others are achieving in Cuba, to put pressure on their own government. Put another way, the interest of a future democratic administration for economic normalization and ending the last remnants of Cold War policy is, I think, likely to grow. And this comes back to what we do and our interest and the interest potentially of the United Kingdom, is we think that that has significant implications for future investment in economic relations with both Cuba and the Caribbean. If Cuba wishes after 2018 to diversify its economic ties in a way that includes a much stronger relationship with the United States, this will require a significant change in the way we think about Cuba. What we're also beginning to see is the probability of a change in the US-Cuba relationship driving others already with very little fanfare to begin to change their positions. In December of this year, it is likely that the EU Council will agree a negotiating mandate for a bilateral agreement between Europe and Cuba, and that may include some sort of asymmetrical trade agreement. Beyond that, EU member states are already moving towards or have established broad-based bilateral agreements irrespective of the EU common position, and that includes the United Kingdom. Canada, Brazil, Russia, China, and to a lesser extent India are engaged economically in quite significant ways in investment in Cuba. In the very recent past, Mexico and Russia have forgiven or restructured much of their debt. And in fact, it certainly seems that, as if almost unspoken, everyone wants to have a new Cuba policy, including perhaps the US. And in that context, I think it's worth looking closely at what's been happening in the United States in terms of the way they've related to Cuba in recent months. There are signs there's already been a gradual move towards a normalization at a functional level with the United States. Most remarkably, the talks on migration continue. In the past, I think one would have been able to assume, when we saw the seizure of the North Korean ship in Panama, given the migration talks were continuing at that time, that the US would have walked away from the table. But they didn't. They just continued. And the US administration so far has said nothing significant at all in that respect. The resumption of postal services negotiations continue. At a very low-key level, there are discussions going on the counter-narcotics interdiction. There seems to be the possibility of the emergence of people-to-people baseball diplomacy about to begin between Cuba and the United States. The number of licensed visitors from the United States is increasing dramatically. Interestingly, when I was looking at these statistics, there were 98,050 from the United States in 2012, and if you compare that to the number of French tourists, it's only slightly less. The US was last year Cuba's largest supplier of food and agricultural products, supplying $465 million worth. And increasingly, what we're seeing is US companies using offshore locations like the Cayman Islands to begin to establish bases to consider how to move into Cuba in the future. As Emily mentioned, in Cuba itself, there are significant changes underway in the context of foreign investment. There will probably within the next months be some major announcements in relation to foreign investment. And there is a huge focus now initially on the development zone at Mariel, but there are also other development zones planned in other parts of the country. And these are particularly to attract foreign investment in a completely different regime, which is not necessarily the national environment, it's a special environment. And these development zones won't just be for manufacturing, or initially, of course, as a container and transshipment port, but they will be for manufacturing, for export, and for the domestic economy. In the hinterland around Mariel, for instance, there are likely to be opportunities for investments in leisure activities, hotels, villa accommodation, golf courses, and offshore oil services. And perhaps, given Mariel's proximity to the United States, it will become the major port eventually if there is some normalization of some kind in the economic relationship. I think what is very clear to us is that others in other countries have seen this and are already investing. And I think the message I want to leave is that the UK is, in all of this, woefully behind companies from Brazil, for instance, from other EU states. In that context, one of the things we'll be doing as a Cuba initiative next year is there'll be a seminar in Havana to talk about closer UK-Cuban investment and trade. We will be putting on a major seminar on the Mariel Free Zone, and Lord Hutton will take a visit by UK investors during the course of the year. I think the message I really want to put across here is that if, as seems increasingly likely, when Raul Castro steps down, there will be a very slow and gradual move to normalize economic relations, not political relations, then we in the United Kingdom are extremely late in the day in getting involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And now Professor Antoni Kapcia.
Okay, I'm going to take up those issues that were raised and pick up on what about the politics of it all. And there are two issues on the politics that I want to focus on. One is, how do these reforms fit within what we know about the revolution? Is he a Gorbachev? Is he saying goodbye to the system? Is that what it's all about? The second issue is, how has he actually managed it? Because it's not easy to push some of these reforms through. So the very first issue I'll deal with quickly is, yes, of course, there's a mismatch. If you assume that the revolution is indeed a Marxist-Leninist system following communist lines as was operating in Eastern Europe between 1948 and 1989. And Raul was one of the people who was most keen in the 1960s on going in that direction. He was the only one of the leadership who was a member of the Young Communists before, and he was always a Marxist in his thinking, and to him it was fairly straightforward. He wasn't alone, by the way. If, however, you do what I suggest you do, as well as thinking of Cuba as a communist society, think of it in the context of post-colonial nation building after, as was taking place, for example, in Asia or in Africa in the 50s and 60s, then you start to see something slightly different. If you see that as the revolution, and I think by and large the leadership has, and certainly did in the 1950s and early 60s, then of course what's following, what all these reforms are proposing, actually don't seem quite so surprising. It depends, therefore, very, very much on what it actually is. I would argue that what was actually happening in the late 50s, early 60s was indeed a very long delayed process of nation building, of post-colonial nation building. It should have happened in the early 20th century, it should have happened in the 1930s, it happened finally in the 1960s, but that it had a particular ideological flavour. There was a natural gravitation towards a socialist model in common with actually any number of other post-colonial nation building projects in Africa and Asia. Most of them, one way or another, called themselves socialist. All of them had some sort of Marxist element to them. So the Cuban gravitation in that direction was not unusual at all. Plus, of course, the moment the United States opposed, it was logical that Cuba would turn to the only one other sugar economy capable of taking Cuban sugar. The nature of the world sugar economy from the 1930s onwards was such that all sugar producers needed a preferential agreement with one large economy. There was only one large economy outside the existing system capable of taking that. So there was a pragmatic reason for moving in that direction as well, but it was ideological. There's no doubt that the leaders of Cuba were on the left. There's no doubt there was a Marxist element in their thinking, and there was a gravitation there to some extent, naturally. But this is the same Raul who we dismissed as an ideologue in the 1960s, as a hardliner, who in the 1980s actually streamlines the armed forces as Minister of Defence by bringing in Japanese management consultants. This is the same Raul who in the 1990s then is the person most associated with the reforms, the unprecedented reforms that, to quote, saved the revolution. He brings in dollarization, he brings in the cuenta propia sector, the self-employed sector. He, in other words, starts to break all the shibboleths. He starts to do things that no one quite expected. And of course, from his point of view, he was saving the revolution. He was defending the revolution. That was interesting because there was a huge debate going on in Cuba, as there always is. The debate in the early 90s was, how do we save the revolution? Well, what they came up with was the reform program, which he was associated with. But the next debate immediately was, yes, but what are we saving? What actually is the revolution? Because plenty of people thought that the effects of the reforms were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There were some things being sacrificed. There was greater inequality. There were some of the problems of the 1950s were returning, not on the scale they had done. So there was a big debate about what was the revolution. And the answer that most people came up with gradually was what they had in 1958 to 61. I said 58, by the way, not 59. In other words, what was already developing before they actually took power. Before, in other words, the Cold War distorted it. Now, I don't mean the Cold War made them go communist. I mean the Cold War limited the possibilities, but also gave an option, which wasn't there before. But there's something else that went on, because it wasn't just simply a pragmatic move towards communism. The fact is that since that point, every Cuban who of a certain age has gone through 30 years of not just association with the socialist bloc and with socialist ways of thinking, but many of them, we have generation after generation, trained in the Eastern Bloc, educated by textbooks and thinking coming from the Eastern Bloc. Well, you can't get rid of that. It would be like saying to someone, yes, you've been a Catholic for 30 years and you've turned against it now, so just forget all that. You can't. It sticks. And so some of that has stuck very clearly. The other thing that happened, of course, in that same period was Cuba was isolated. And that has created all sorts of problems of what a siege mentality actually does, of course. It creates some restrictions, but also it created a kind of togetherness, a collective togetherness, which actually mattered to people. So when people in Cuba in the 1990s started complaining about the loss of solidarity, a sense of solidarity, they weren't necessarily lamenting the loss of what they might or might not have called communism. It actually was that togetherness that had been developed in the 60s and 70s in particular. So I think that it's not easy to say that actually what is being proposed now is against the revolution. It very much depends on whose definition of revolution you're picking up. There is, however, one flaw that I'll pick on before I move on to the second question there. The flaw is the self-employed sector, because the self-employed sector has existed since the early 90s. It was roughly 200,000 people, roughly, by the time it settled down, and yet it wasn't really, because everybody knew that actually there were twice that number working illegally. And the idea of the reforms was to get those people inside the legal sector. In other words, to get about 400,000. And that's roughly the figure at the moment, as far as I know. Except that when Raul published his plans, it was 1 million. 1 million people to be lost from the state sector within 1 year, which would be soaked up by the self-employed sector, partly because the self-employed would actually, for the first time, be allowed to employ. That makes them more than self-employed. That actually makes them small businesses. And I think that's really quite important, because I know that several people I know in Cuba are starting to worry that what's being done there is to create a petty bourgeoisie. In other words, if you have been created, your thinking has been shaped by those 30 years or more of relationship with the Marxist versions coming from the Soviet bloc, then obviously the creation of a petty bourgeoisie is a major problem. If you follow Marxist dialectics, you've created a class which is antithetical to what is actually being proposed up till now. So there is really a problem. And I've been saying for some time, and I've got it wrong every time, that the moment you've got a cuenta propia sector, you have to have a mass organisation to cope with it. Because they did that with the private farmers in the early 60s. They did that with the sudden sector that was created by the military retirements. You suddenly had a large number of people who didn't fit into a sector, into a mass organisation. They created an organisation for them. Why didn't they create one for the cuenta propistas? Well, my guess is that Fidel didn't actually believe in them anyway and thought it was a short-term measure that would at one stage be disappearing. Well, that's clearly not Raul's version. But if you've got 500,000 people, what do you do with them? Why not create a cuenta propia sector for them? At the moment they're taken care of by the trade unions, CTC. That makes no sense at all if they're employing people. They're employers, not workers. So it really becomes very difficult indeed. So there is a dilemma there, very clearly. That brings me to the second question then. How has he pushed this through? There has been resistance. We hear about the resistance from the party, as though the party thinks monolithically, which actually in Cuba it clearly doesn't. It never has done. But it's mostly supposedly comes from the old guard. But Raul is one of the old guard. The people we call the old guard are the ex-guerrillas who have consistently remained all the way through and are there still in quite prominent positions, including some of the higher ministers are quite clearly members of that old guard. So it isn't all the old guard who might resist. But anyway, when they resist, they're resisting actually on behalf of several generations of Cubans who don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater either. So there are actually large numbers of Cubans who look at, for example, the toleration of prostitution in the 1990s and said, that's shameful. That's not what we actually fought the revolution for. So the old guard in the party are not alone by any means. But there was resistance, and the resistance was reinforced partly because the party congress never met. It's supposed to meet every 5 years, and when it doesn't meet every 5 years, you know there's something going on. There's a debate going on, there's no settlement to the argument. Well, there was the last party congress before the recent one was 1997, so the next one should have been 2002. It actually finally happened in 2011. And in the meantime, what was happening was that the resistance in the party was building up there quite clearly. It was partly because actually some people in the party didn't agree with what Fidel was doing. They didn't agree with his battle of ideas. They clearly didn't. They also didn't like something else that was going on, which was his reliance on the group that was called the Grupo de Apoyo, the little kitchen cabinet around him that he created, which was a younger generation, supposedly the future vanguard, who had not been guerrillas in the Sierra, who couldn't be relied on in quite the same way, and therefore the code of collective loyalty was a little bit broken by that. So there was resistance already to Fidel, never mind Raul, and therefore there was foot dragging, there was arguments going on. And we know that because when Raul comes to power in 2008, first thing he says is, we'll call a congress. That congress. It took him 3 years to get it called. So the resistance carried on, and it was only when he threatened a special conference to, quote, make the necessary generational changes, that, okay, it happened then. But it took 3 years and threats to do it. But interestingly, in the meantime, what he did was to turn his attention instead to the government. Now we normally used to hear in Eastern Europe about the government was just a rubber stamp on behalf of the party. It was the party that decided things and the government enacted it. Actually what was happening often in the 2000s, once Raul came to power, was the other way round. He was actually using the government to make decisions and obliging the party to follow. So there was a degree of outmaneuvering there. He also did something else. He organised national consultations to try and outflank the resistance. And indeed, all the national consultations that he organised did come up with exactly the answers he wanted, partly because he asked the right questions, but also he was well attuned to what was going on, what the thinking was at grassroots. But he had to do something else. The system in Cuba, and I'll finish on this point, is always about negotiation. Always. If you want to get anything done in Cuba, you negotiate constantly. And that's the same if you're a visitor to Cuba, if you live in Cuba, or if you're the president of Cuba. It's a constant process of negotiation at every level. You have to balance up. You appoint a reformer, you have to appoint an old guard. There's a constant movement, pushing and shoving going on there. The proof of that came very clearly with his announcement of 1 million job losses in a year. Straight away, the trade union organisation, which was dismissed in the 1960s as meaningless, because it was just talking about production all the time, actually resisted. And they forced him to negotiate. They forced that million down to 500,000, although the million's still on the book somewhere. They forced 1 year to a much slower pace. They did negotiate it down. Now, of course, it could have been that's what he intended all along. If I want to get 500,000 done in a few years, maybe I'll just simply say 1 million just to threaten them. But the negotiation was what had to happen. And that's why I suspect the process that Emily referred to of no sense of urgency comes about, because there is that constant negotiation all the time. You always have to negotiate with who's going to be affected by it. Interestingly, when he came to power, he did actually say, I want to get rid of that dual currency before I leave office. And he did already say quite early on that he would leave office, that he would change the law to have only 2 successive terms as president. So effectively he had 10 years. Well, 5.5 years have gone already. He's got 4.5 left. And he clearly knows, as David said, that it's his generation who've got to make the changes and make them legitimate to be acceptable to the ones who want change and the ones who don't want change. That's his job now, and I think that's why he's probably accelerating now, but at the same time it's a constant negotiation. So watch this space.
Okay, I'd like to open the floor to questions for either the entire panel or specific members of the panel. And when you ask a question, would you be kind enough to identify yourself so we know where you're coming from? Thank you very much.
Do I press here? No.
No, just
No.
Just shout.
Shout, yes.
Flavia Campilli. I'm just like I'm Cuban by mother of reading and many things. But I've been living here for a long time. But anyhow, my question was that, thank you very much, this is more for Emily. Despite all these economic reforms introduced by Castro, Raul, Cuba continues to rely heavily on Venezuela's subsidized oil and payments for the medical and other services that are rendered by Cuba. How would Cuba offset this negative impact of Venezuela facing today's serious economic crisis in Venezuela, were to cut or sharply reduce its aid to Cuba?
Should we take some or?
Probably one at a time, actually, if that helps.
Estimates have been done about the impact of the loss of the Venezuelan tide. Definitely it's very big, and if you look at the data, the largest part of it is the payment for Cuban professional services in return for supplies of oil. And the part of that equation which would hit Cuba most enormously is the financing for the oil. Cuba could get oil from other places, but it's the preferential terms on which they get it. And the estimates have been, I mean, it's nothing like the degree of dependency on the Soviet bloc. It's not like that at all, because now Cuba has nickel, it has tourism, it has a much wider range of economic partners than it had before. Clearly the Cuban trade negotiators are working very, very hard to find other partners, and the Mariel is a very good example of that. This is with their Brazilian predominantly partnership, but also other important ones. So I think if it had happened maybe a couple of years ago, it would have been worse than today. And one estimate I saw was suggesting that the GDP, if it happens in 5 years' time, the impact on GDP will be less than 4%. Yeah. But between now and then, it's so that's the kind of estimate, that's the kind of degree. But the 4%, if you think of a 4% contraction under current circumstances, would be incredibly difficult for Cuba to manage, actually, because there's huge expectations of improvement at the moment, and so if you had a setback of that sort, it would be very bad. But in terms of finding other suppliers, yes, that would be available. Possibly they could negotiate, financing from China now, or their other friends in Brazil and so on, but it's a big chunk. It's a big chunk.
So perhaps I could just add to that. One of the things that's become very apparent in the last year is a sort of dash for alternative energy. So that over the next few months, I think there'll be a significant number of announcements with new incentives. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it wasn't produced as it should have been. But alternative, yes, it's not the same.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Please.
I'll also make a comment, is that okay?
Yes, why not?
There's clearly things happening in Cuba today which weren't happening some years ago. But the whole course of the Cuban Revolution is that things happen which weren't happening a few years ago, depending on what was going on in the world. The 10 despicable years, as Fidel called the 1970s, where they copied too much from the Soviet Union, the 90s as a result of the special period of peacetime, whatever it was. And the only way of understanding, I think, what's happening in Cuba today is to place Cuba in the world that the revolution is living in and fighting in, with a tremendous absence of revolutionary struggle and a deep crisis of world capitalism. So, how that is going to impact and play out in Cuba is far more important, I would submit, than particular changes in personnel and government and so on and so forth. Second, Che Guevara once put it this way. He said, insofar as the Cuban Revolution is Marxist, it's because we've discovered by our own course, struggle, and so forth, Marxism, not because we borrowed it from somewhere else. And in actual fact, in Fidel's last major speech in 2005, he said, our greatest mistake was to think that somebody knew somewhere how to build socialism. The Marxism of the revolution has been created by the fact that when you engage in revolutionary struggle, you change yourself as well as the circumstances. And there are millions of Cubans who are ardent defenders of their revolution and will do so in today's world. And it's because of that, I submit, that no US administration is going to fundamentally change, least of all under democratic presidents, who have been arguably the most hostile to the Cuban Revolution, and what's happening today. Cuba remains on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Things like the Korean arms shipment in Panama, the embargo continues, and of course, 5 decent, steadfast, working class fighters remain, or at least 4 of them, remain locked up in US prisons. If there was going to be any change, then in my view, what the US administration would do would have been to release them, and they're not going to do that. They framed them up, they gave them punitive sentences, and they're keeping them locked up. So, although I think interpretation is very, very important, I don't want to, there's a retreat going on, politics is very, very challenging in Cuba. To paraphrase Karl Marx, academics have sought to interpret the Cuban Revolution in various ways. The point, however, is to defend it. And the heart of that, I submit to all of you, is to do what you can to get the Cuban 5 out of prison.
Would any of the panel care to respond to the comments?
I'll just pick up one thing there, actually, from Jonathan. Yeah, your point about Marxism being there already and growing out of it. Yeah, I certainly don't want to create the impression that it was borrowed, that it wasn't there already. I think there's little doubt. If you look, for example, at the program, if you can get through all the verbiage of History Will Absolve Me, the program there, which actually was remarkably close to the program that was actually put into effect in the first 5 or 6 years, was social democratic. Really, when you look at it, it really wasn't that radical, but it would have gone down well in at least Britain if they bothered about land and things like that. Wasn't particularly radical, but in the context of the Cold War, in the context of the relationship with the United States, at that time, it became radical. And so the Marxism that had partly led them in that direction, and was part of the Cuban tradition of dissent, of radical dissent, then I think moved logically in a different direction, in a more radical direction. In a sense, therefore, there was a mixture of accident, circumstance, and the organic movement coming through from below that produced the particular version of Marxism that they started to develop. So I use the term communist always in inverted commas when I'm talking of Cuba, because I want to get away from thinking about Eastern European models. But I don't want to move away from it altogether. I still would suggest that actually using that term with a small c, using the term Marxist, actually does mean that you can actually say, yes, it's the same as what happened in Ghana, it's the same as what happened in Algeria, but with a very particular ideological flavour. So it's a good point.
I'm Alberto Vandermeer. I'm a Cuban based in London. I'm associated with the Cuban Financial Fund in Amsterdam. I represent here. My question is a rather political one. That's to Professor Antoni Kapcia. In Cuba, economists take a backseat to politicians, particularly generals in the army. And it has to do with the reforms, which refer to Cuba's planteamientos. And a lot of them seem to just be an exercising gaining time for this older generation to pass on the ideas of the revolution, and particularly the succession of the new vice president. And the question specific is, do you think this vice president, I think it's Martinez-Canel, is actually going to take power? Because now there is a son of Raul Castro, Colonel Alejandro Castro, who is being groomed, and they say that this is just a smoke screen. So the question is, do you think Martinez-Canel will actually be the head of the Cuban state, or will it be Alejandro Castro?
I'm absolutely certain it will not be Alejandro Castro. Absolutely certain, because I react against the idea of dynasticism, I have to say, because it's just too easy an explanation. Raul is there not because he's Fidel's brother, but because he was the surviving leader of the guerrilla group. That's quite clear. Besides which, I actually think that, although I'm always a little bit wary of if we can identify the successor. This was the case when Laje was identified, Alarcón was identified, someone else has already identified him and said, all right, he's the one we watch. So the fact that Díaz-Canel has been elected as the senior vice president would suggest that he's likely to do it, and he does fit the model that we know Raul prefers. Well, yes, he's not a military person, but on the other hand, he's reliable, he's trusted, he's efficient, all of the things that we know Raul, but not just Raul, people like Ramiro Valdés as well, people like that they like. So I suspect that he is still in the running, but what I strongly suspect is that, for example, if Raul were to fall under a bus today, and that's it, he wouldn't succeed immediately. It would be probably Ramiro Valdés, I suspect. It would be someone from that generation and that background, that guerrilla background, because that transition between generations is actually much more important than probably the transition between one system and another, because that's not what's happening anyway. So I do think it's guesswork, but my money is probably on Díaz-Canel succeeding. My ability to predict is a little bit variable.
Michael, on the 2 points, the first for Emily and Professor Kapcia, perhaps, and the second for David Jessop. From the 60s on, there were reams of writing about the heinousness of markets that were exploited in very strong anti-capitalist rhetoric. Now we have functioning capitalist enterprises in Cuba. What I'm not aware of, and this perhaps relates to what you said, Professor Kapcia, of people being schooled in Eastern European models, textbooks coming from there. I'm not aware of any kind of theoretical underpinning in Cuba of Cuban origin of market, defending market mechanisms or providing some kind of theoretical defense for what is happening de facto. So that's that point. And for David Jessop, on the question of investment in Cuba in this country, there is always the question of what you can get past shareholders, and it remains a fact that the Cuban human rights record is not ideal. If you look at something like the Sakharov Prize given by the European Parliament for freedom of thought, there have been 3 Cuban winners in the last 10 years. Exception, no other country comes anywhere near that. There have also been a lot of incidents which are, to put it most useful, most neutral, very dubious. I spent a couple of weeks in Stockholm in the summer. The Swedes do not believe the Cuban government version of the death of Osvaldo Paya. And I think more will be coming out about that. And to take a very current example from a month ago, at a private church meeting in Olvi, a member of Paya's party was set upon in a so-called acto de repudio, slashed, wasn't killed, was carted, luckily survived in hospital after massive loss of blood. Now that is not an isolated incident. I know of others. That's simply the most recent report I got. I think my point is that I'm not sure that the defenders of investing in Cuba are going to find it quite easy when that sort of record is put up against when they can invest in plenty of other places.
Well, just briefly add that, Julia and Atlantic, we are actually investment managers. And one of our colleagues in the investment management community has just come out of 18 months in jail, so that obviously doesn't help.
Thank you.
Take the first one about the about there not being a model. I think it's true that no, it's definitely true that the whole attitude towards markets has changed. And if you look at Cuba's position in the world economy, it was easier to dismiss markets when you had a relationship with your main trading partner where the terms of trade were determined by negotiation and not by the market. So Cuba finds itself now exposed to the global market and has to respond. And yes, ideologically, it leaves people without any kind of model to hold on to or to refer to in some ways. Except, I mean, what seems to be emerging to me at the moment is this. They've looked at other places. They've been studying very carefully. The economists certainly, and politically, they've been touring the world, looking at how it's done in other places. Obviously, Vietnam and China are of interest in the sense that they're communist countries using market reforms. But you talk to any Cuba who's involved in that discussion, and then they immediately point out all the differences. There are very important differences between the kind of economy that Cuba has and the kind of economy that those countries have. And so the kind of conclusion that they seem to be coming to, and this is, you know, I've been involved in those discussions, is that the Cuban model is something that is in creation. They're trying to work out something. There is a new department in Havana University, in a way, that's looking at the Cuban model, trying to characterize the Cuban model in this way. But I would characterize it, I suppose, at the moment. I think the lineamientos are not just a matter of, you said, sort of holding the fort or stopping things from happening, gaining time. I think that they do constitute a very important part of the model. You know, the model is managing an economy within the constraints that Cuba has. And what they have is a set of guidelines as kind of to refer to while they're doing that maneuver. It is unclear, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty and doubts and all the rest of it going on. It's probably Raul, if you like, his biggest weakness is that he's not a leader who leads from the front and tells everybody exactly what's happening. It's he's a very much a negotiator, which does leave people not quite knowing where they're going. But I think at the moment, the Cuban economy is actually totally chaotic at the moment. It's definitely between one thing and another. You know, nothing adds up in Cuba at the moment. It's a very, very confusing time. And I think, in a way, this whole sorting out of the exchange rate is a way to kind of bring it back to some kind of sense of manageability. Anyway, so that's...
I would just add one thing to that, that in some respects, Emily would know more than I would about this, but it is possible to construct a history of the 1960s in Cuba on the basis of the economic choices available to them. Because what was clear, I think, in 59-60 was that they were following a classic Prebisch model, but they couldn't, eventually, either because of the embargo or because of the lack of private investment. So the private sector could not actually maintain itself. But of course, by that stage, they were then moving into the so-called Great Debate, which then did determine that actually you shouldn't be moving in that direction anyway, in the direction of markets. Except, of course, if you did actually believe in markets in Cuba in the 1960s, mid-60s, it was a nonsense, because you had nothing to sell. So there's a real, in a sense, the so-called moral economy made perfect sense. Because what's the point of paying people more when you can't actually provide them with anything to buy? You might just as well get them to work harder for other reasons rather than that. So you could actually see the ideas of markets that were around at the time, but in the end, in the 1960s, it was meaningless. But interestingly, those who argued for markets were the ones who actually came back into authority in the 70s and 80s, talking about decentralized market socialism, which was a classic learner model in Eastern Europe and so on. That was the model they went for. They've had to learn really fast, of course, since then. So there are ideas on the stocks somewhere. Whether they're relevant any longer is another question. Sorry about that long answer.
Okay, to pick up the point you made about investment, I mean, all board decisions on investment in Cuba are complex. The number of companies I know that have considered a whole range of issues, including, as you point out, human rights, return on capital, safety of investment, etc., is substantial, apart from the fact that there are laws, US laws, that in fact make it extremely difficult for UK or other European companies trading with Cuba if they have a US position. So I don't dispute with you that there are likely to be difficulties in any kind of board decision. What I do think is interesting is what is happening in the context of the European Commission just receiving or starting to receive permission for a negotiating mandate to negotiate a bilateral agreement between the European Union and Cuba. It hasn't been signed off yet. It will be signed off probably in December. But that is a very unusual agreement because it covers a whole range of different aspects of the relationship, including political relationship, political dialogue, human rights, and a whole range of other issues. So it's clear that there are a number of European states that are concerned, but the fact is that the majority not only have gone forward with this, but it looks likely in December that all EU member states will agree to that, because it also provides a framework for discussions, not just in an investment context, but broadly, more broadly speaking, on human rights, governance, etc. In Cuba. But I take your point, and it's up to every company to take that decision. Some companies have had terrible experiences, but they went into Cuba seeking opportunity, but the outcome wasn't favourable, and in some cases particularly damaging for individuals.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Perhaps just one last question, if it's not too long, and then we'll call it that.
My name is John X, and I'm with Greenbridge Trading, and we have investment and trading in Cuba. And one question is for Emily, and the other one for David. Firstly, on the unification of the currency, it's clear that there's both the political rate that will be set and the economic rate to be set. And in Europe, we saw the struggle on the Euro and Deutschmark being merged. The political answer was 1-to-1. The economists reckoned 4 or 5 Ostmarks to 1 Deutschmark, but it was the political rate that was set. And given the earlier question saying the politicians stand well in front of the economists, I want to know how much this 7-to-1 is ratified by the politicians, and what sort of time frame they want to implement that. You know, in Germany it was a specific date, and it was 1-to-1, and it cost them 7 to 10 years in their economy to recover because of that decision. The second one is to clarify with David that the Americans clearly relaxing their policy with respect to tourism. I think the US is now number 2 to Canada in terms of tourists coming into the States. But you mentioned the food and agricultural policy, and I'm wondering, is that being relaxed at the moment? Are they allowing agricultural equipment to come in from America, or is that going to be one of the next steps to facilitate Cuba becoming self-sufficient in its own food supply?
Well, so the exchange rate one quickly. I don't think they've got the room for manoeuvre for the exchange rate they set to be a politically set exchange rate. They've done that. They've tried that. They've tried a fixed exchange rate. They had the black market. They've got that experience. So, I mean, what always surprises people when you talk about Cuba is actually their monetary discipline is very tight. They are exposed to the world market. They don't have the reserves or the resources. They don't have a West Germany to help them. So the exchange rate that they have will have to be a market rate. So it's not just that the economists will win, it's just that they don't have any choice if they're going to have a unified rate. So I don't think it'll be politically held. I think the regime may be such that it's not flexible enough. You know, there may be a dispute about that at some stage, but I don't think that, no, I don't think that's going to happen. I would say, I'd bet. That's my bet.
In answer to your question, what I was suggesting is that the process of change in terms of mood with the United States is underway. There's a whole range of background discussions taking place. I mean, for instance, I think there were 6 senatorial visits to Cuba during the course of last year. The specific question you're asking, I think, will have to be driven by the United States. I don't see any sign at the moment that the US administration is going to ease up. For instance, you mentioned agricultural equipment. But that process is I suspect, going to be step by step. And one of the things that interests us is that US corporations are stimulated by the opportunity, the big opportunity they see in Cuba. And the political pressure that they are bringing in Washington is increasing. And there is a scenario, whether this takes place or not, that is not necessarily dissimilar to what happened in Vietnam, where when it became apparent that the United States was going to normalize fully its relations with Vietnam, US companies ran for Vietnam before there was a formal opening. And one of the scenarios I can envisage, post Raul Castro stepping down, and a gradual normalization, I'm talking some way away, is just that happening in the context of Cuba. And at that moment, particularly in the areas like the development zones, the Cubans being far more welcoming towards direct US investment in Cuba.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid I've got to call it a day there. I'd like once again to thank the Institute of Latin American Studies, Latin American Newsletters and the Caribbean Council for their support for this event. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Please do pick up the document, the Latin American Newsletter white paper on currency reform and the Caribbean Council's Cuban briefing. They're there at your disposal. I'm very grateful to our distinguished panel, and I'd like you to show your appreciation for them. Thank you very much.